Good morning.
Good morning. Hello, guys. Glad to have you back. All right, so getting right down into it, I want to stop a few times to ask for questions. Are there any questions to begin with? Anything unclear? Anybody want to communicate anything? Remember also you could type something. I'm getting little text on the screen, and that's nice as well. All right. Okay, so with this week, right? Be sure that you do your textbook quizzes that are due on Sunday evening. All right, make sure that you do your second textbook quiz. Notice also for the first two quizzes, I'm allowing you to do it as many times as you want. So feel free to continue to take it until you ace it. But I don't know if I feel comfortable with doing that the entire semester. So I'll probably end up putting an end to that. But at least for the first two or three, I'm gonna let you guys do that, do multiple submissions. Okay, so be sure that you do that by Sunday evening. You guys are doing very well on the argumentative stuff. Your class is next for me as far as doing another assignment or two. So I apologize if I haven't done anything besides the first one for you guys. I will play catch up very quickly, very soon. But you guys are doing well. So then, speaking of which, the argumentative assignment, right? What we're going to do is we're going to kind of kill two birds with one stone as far as the test goes, and then also the weekly assignment. All right. So I still have the test up there to let you guys see exactly what I'm throwing at you. Let's see here. So with New England, right? Notice it's number 28 on the test, and then it also coincides with number 1 on the argumentative assignment, should you choose number 1, is a guy named David Hackett Fisher, spelled F-I-S-A or F-I-S-C-H-E-R. David Hackett Fisher, he gives a very simple thesis in his book called New Albion, as he says that whatever demographic from England was the most successful at colonizing a given area, they made that area in their own image, right? They tried to replicate what they lived like back in England over here. So they call it also transplanting or transplantations, where they try to transplant old Mother England over here across the Atlantic. So at any rate, what he says is with the South, as you may recall in the Black Legend handout, is it was mainly the gentry class, Gentry, and they, by today's standards, were pretty archaic. They were pretty old school and out of touch. They were from a bygone kind of feudal era whereby they expected to be called sir or lord. They were above using their own hands for work. Their wealth was in commanding labor of other people to work on their plantations for them and engage in cash crop farming or pastoralism with sheep, etc. And so the gentry class came and they kind of remade things in their own image, or tried to, at least in Virginia, says this argument. And so a few people owned most of the land. A few people sat on the governing council of Virginia. And you saw how that would have kind of a combustible reaction in Bacon's Rebellion and stuff like that, right? But contrast that with New England. They contend that people from the city moved to New England rather than the gentry class, the new middle class. Generically, they're called the bourgeoisie, which I think technically means people from the city. All right. So the people who came into the New England area were largely bourgeois from the cities. And so kind of like today, when you look at people in San Francisco, et cetera, is they saw themselves as being very progressive, forward looking, at the forefront of any type of change that was going on in society or in world history. And so they, right, were oftentimes the beneficiaries of the change away from the feudal economy, in which people had more opportunities to start a business, to gain a loan, to become a merchant and to travel somewhere to gain a commodity and go sell it elsewhere, right? And so the people that were beginning in the 1400s, especially in the Italian city-states, they began moving to the cities, and they had a Latin term that translated as urban air is free air. You're freer once you're in a city because you have no feudal lord to tell you what to do and owe feudal dues to, etc. That you could start your own business, etc. The money economy was taking off, etc. And what happens oftentimes in history is when a socioeconomic group starts coming into its own and becoming successful economically, right? It doesn't take long for them to resent, for their expectations to rise, and for them to resent being marginalized politically. So the bourgeoisie, right? They're like, wait a minute, the gentry class are on the Privy Council of the King. They're in the House of Lords, and they along with the King or Queen of England are running the show. What about us? We're doing well, we're successful, we're respectable people, we're helping the economy boom. And so we demand more rights. And so it's probably not a coincidence, say a lot of people, that with the development of a bourgeois city class came more rights for the parliament, and in particularly the lower house of parliament, for people who were not noblemen. And what do you know? Most of the elected reps in parliaments throughout Western Europe happen to be members of the successful bourgeoisie. So the idea is when they came here to Boston for the Massachusetts Bay Colony, or to Plymouth amongst the Pilgrims, that they were already forward-looking people who expected to have certain rights and certain opportunities, etc., right? So when they came, for instance, they claimed to be very democratic religiously. Which of course we're going to get into how that can be very much contested, but this is their claim nonetheless, right? As it goes back to the Reformation of the early to mid 1500s, when Martin Luther and other reformers who rebelled against the Catholic Church complained that the Catholic Church was too hierarchical. Right? You have the Pope, the cardinals, the archbishops, the bishops, then the priests of the diocese and the friars. There's a set hierarchy. You have to be especially set aside and sanctified in the Catholic Church to be able to preach and read from Scripture and teach people biblical interpretation with the Catholic Church, right? Well, Martin Luther says, he used an expression, the priesthood of all believers. And he said, anyone who has the Holy Spirit in him, who has been born again, because Jesus in the New Testament of the Bible, I know there's a lot of religion today, told a guy named Nicodemus that you cannot go to heaven unless you're born again. And so with Christianity, it's like a mystical experience where the Holy Spirit or Christ or both come and live and dwell within you and make you a new creation so that you could belong to God. And so at any rate, with Martin Luther, he contended any person who has been born again has the Spirit of God inside him or her and is empowered and entitled to read the Bible for him or herself, interpret the Bible for him or herself, right? And then not to mention, every congregation, he said, should not be told what to do by a bishop or an archbishop. So they formed these congregational churches, the Pilgrims and the Puritans. And in a congregational church, the church members got together and they voted on who they wanted to be their reverend or their pastor, right? Like their priest. And they could also unelect that person by popular vote and oust that person and bring someone else who they believe is doing a better job. And like I said, every church was virtually autonomous. It was virtually independent. So they were proud of that, at being democratic and more egalitarian in their religion. Along with wanting kids to be able to read the Bible for themselves, the Puritans were the first to establish a public school system for boys and girls. And so by today's standards, the education was very rudimentary and very religiously oriented, but it taught basic literacy. And so the New England colonies, together, Massachusetts Bay, Plymouth, Connecticut, Rhode Island, New Hampshire, and Maine, they had the highest literacy rates in the colonies all the way up through the War for Independence. And so the Puritans are proud of that, right? And then along with education, is some of the Puritan leaders established the first Ivy League schools, particularly Harvard in 1636. And yes, the education was primarily intended to provide future pastors or preachers, to equip them theologically in the doctrine of Christianity, of Protestant Christianity, and their particular denominational beliefs. But also they had a somewhat of a classical education. They read the classic Greek and Roman works. They did the hard sciences. Some of them, right, like Jonathan Edwards, became renowned in sciences that were outside theology, the study of God and religion. For instance, arachnids with Jonathan Edwards. He found some groundbreaking information about spiders, etc. And so hence the Puritans were amongst the first to use inoculation. And I use inoculation and vaccines interchangeably out of ignorance, because that's way out of my realm of expertise. But right, the idea of giving just a little bit of the sickness, the pathogens to someone, enough for their white blood cell count to be able to handle, to gain an identification of. So in the future, when it sees that pathogen coming at it, it's better equipped to take it on. So the Puritans were at the forefront of that as well. They also allowed private property, the ability for people to engage in free enterprise and gain credit and start businesses. The Puritans gained a reputation for being enterprising. And to me, enterprising is a combination of being diligent, of being very hardworking, always at work, always up to something, and also being very inventive, as far as at the forefront of new inventions. And at the new inventions, I would say mainly their grist and sawmills and their metallurgical grog shops, as they were called, for making metal objects. They were at the forefront of technology and utilizing water power. And then in the future, in the early 1800s, they will be at the forefront in this region with steam power, the use of steam power as well. And to some people, right, it's not a coincidence that they were a very forward-looking, progressive city people, bourgeois people, right? So number one is very much court history. It's praising the Puritans, it's bragging on them. Remember, court history brags about the winners, those who politically win, economically win, and socially win, right? So any questions so far on number one? All right. So moving on, let's see here. Number two, intolerant New England. So as you could tell from the title, I take a 180 on number two, right? And then I kind of bash New Englanders. And so on number two, for one, right, the way that they treated Native Americans. Now, the exception is supposed to be the Pilgrims. The Pilgrims came in 1620, right? They were facing persecution for their newspaper and their church back in Scrooby, Scrooby, England. And as many of them were being arrested by William Laud, Laud, the Archbishop of Canterbury, the prime Archbishop of England. So notice they had an Archbishop in England, right? The Anglican Church, arguably, some people jokingly say that the Anglican Church is like a diet Catholic Church. It doesn't have the Pope, but virtually everything else it has. It has the same hierarchy of archbishops, bishops, dioceses, priests, etc. It also is kind of in the middle theologically with the belief on salvation, right? With the Protestant Reformation, they made it adamant claim that they believed the Bible stated that people are saved as a free gift, right? By grace through faith, and that there's nothing you could do but accept the forgiveness that Jesus offers you. A lot of religion today, I apologize, but with the Catholic Church, right? They met together at Trent and decided, no, we're standing our ground on certain issues. And amongst those issues that they stood their ground on was the study of salvation, soteriology, as they believe that you are saved by faith plus works, right? And so the Anglican Church, with the Protestants, they threw out 7 apocryphal books, kind of disputed books amongst the canon of Bible. The Bible was brought together in the 300s at Nicaea in Turkey, and 7 books were kind of set aside because there was kind of argument over them. And in those 7 books is a book called Second Maccabees, and it makes reference to something that seems like purgatory. And so, but with the Protestants, right, they said, well, wait a minute, if you're saved by grace, why would you go to a place besides heaven and hell when you die to continue to do penance and work off your sins before you can go to heaven? It was incongruent with their thesis on salvation. So, of course, Martin Luther and others threw that book and the other 6 apocryphal books out. The Anglican Church kept those books. So in England, right, amongst the future Pilgrims and Puritans, the Pilgrims wanted to separate from the church and go and worship as they please. In 1620, remember the Thanksgiving story, etc., right? The Puritans wanted to stay within the Anglican Church, but, quote, purify it and change it from within and make it more in line with the Protestant Reformation and make it, quote, less Catholic, all right? So a lot of religion today. So at any rate, when the Pilgrims came in 1620, they were arguably vulnerable when they first got here. And there was kind of a quid pro quo process. You scratch my back, I scratch yours, right? Is the Wampanoag leader, Massasoit coveted the English cannon and gunpowder. They coveted his warriors and his military aid because they were so small in numbers. And so they made a military alliance of equality, right? And they celebrated that military alliance at Thanksgiving. Massasoit almost died. A guy named Carver, an Englishman that he favored, came and had befriended him and gave him, does someone have a question? Anybody have a question at all? By all means, let me know, okay? All right. So they gave medicine, an elixir, as they called it back then, and it helped Massasoit live. And then Massasoit, in turn, warned them of the Massachusetts tribe about to attack them. And so the Pilgrims hit the Massachusetts before the Massachusetts could hit them. And so that's kind of part they don't tell us as kids about Thanksgiving, of Massasoit almost dying and of the Pilgrims slaughtering the Massachusetts and something called the Wessagoosett Raid. But at any rate, they were equal allies. When the Puritans came in 1630, within a decade, they had over 30,000 people, 30,000. So they came in much larger numbers. And the idea was, in the primary sources, the Puritans lorded that power over everybody else, including the Puritans. They demanded tribute from people as if they were subjugated people underneath them. They had a double standard on laws. If you came within Puritan New England, around Boston, and you committed a crime that the Puritans considered a crime, but you were Native American or someone from another region, unfamiliar with their laws, you had to pay the price nonetheless. But if you were a Puritan and you went to one of their regions and committed one of their crimes, the Puritans refused to hand you over to be dealt with and punished by their authorities. So they were very kind of haughty, very kind of arrogant, and they lived kind of by a double standard according to the primary sources of several Englishmen who wrote and kept diaries, etc. at this time. So that's what we're looking at with number 2, is mainly it's the Puritans rather than the Pilgrims, but they lorded power over other people. They could have easily avoided the Pequot War with the Pequot tribe of Native Americans, and they were haughty and arrogant in their response to them. Later on, there was a very ugly war called King Philip's War or Metacom's War in 1675. And the Puritans, it wasn't even their war, it was a war with the Pilgrims. And the Puritans came in and were ruthless at a place called Fort Mystic. Fort Mystic, they burnt the people in that city, that hamlet, alive. And those who came screaming out on fire, they shot down, including women, children, and the elderly. And they even, in their primary source, one of the leaders of the Puritans wrote that the scent of the burning Native American flesh was a pleasing aroma in the nostrils of their Christian God. Yikes. So sometimes they could even use religion in an ugly manner toward the Native Americans and make a simple dichotomy in their minds that they were God's people and the Native Americans belonged to the devil. And so hence there's no way of being too ruthless against the devil and his subjects, right? Anything goes. As you've learned, right, with the Holocaust of Nazi Germany, one of the first steps you do is you demonize and dehumanize a group, and then there's no holds barred on how you treat them and get away with it by your own justification. So, like I said, the Puritans came in 1630. By 1636, they had a Pequot War that could have easily been avoided. There was a guy named Captain Stone who was capturing young Native American kids and holding them for ransom to get paid from it. He was finally killed by a couple Pequot warriors, and the Puritans demanded that the warriors be handed over for justice. The Pequot refused, and war broke out. So very avoidable by many people's perspective. And then the one in 1675, the Puritans, the Pilgrims underneath them, right? To their credit, they lasted from 1620 to 1665, 55 years without having a war with the Wampanoag tribe of Massasoit. But when Massasoit died, he had relatives that took over, and one of them's name was Metacom. And Metacom had been angry for years, literally for years, feeling as if the Pilgrims had taken advantage of Massasoit, his relative, and stating that especially with land sales, that they had been taken advantage of. So he comes to Plymouth and he begins making these adamant demands about certain lands given back to the natives, etc. And one of the Pilgrims kind of arrogantly laughs and says, "Who does this man think he is, King Philip of Spain?" And so the name stuck as King Philip's War, but it was Metacom. And another little side note of the Native Americans losing that war with the Pilgrims. So you could say, right, that the war, when it did break out after 55 years of peace between the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag, it broke out over apparent injustices that the Wampanoag had faced, and Metacom was tired of enduring. Metacom would eventually be killed by other Native Americans instead of the Pilgrims, who brought literally his severed head back to the Pilgrims in triumph. Because another kind of sub-theme to this was that the praying towns, as they were called, a guy named Eliot and others, John Eliot and others, they went out of and a guy named Thomas Mayhew, they went out of their way to try to proselytize, make Christians out of the natives. And those who chose to Christianity joined these praying towns. And so to the Native Americans, those joining the praying towns were sellouts. They sold out their Native American culture to become like the white man, right? And so in the midst of the war, there was a place called Deer Island of praying Indians who had become Christians, right? And they were slaughtered by their own tribesmen as who they felt in the heat of rage of battle, that they had become traitors and chosen the wrong side. Well, it was literally family members, loved ones of those converted natives who killed Metacom. And so religion is going to have a divisive effect on Native Americans between those who embrace Christianity and those who do not. And so I just thought I'd throw that out there as well. And then also with number two is how the Puritans could be very exclusive and intolerant domestically amongst one another. So if you read number two, and by all means, please do so, even if you don't choose to do number two on your assignment, is you had to go before a governing board and convince them that you had had a born again experience. If they didn't buy it, you were not accepted as a church member. You had to stay in back as a pariah in the back of church. You could not vote or run for office or participate in the New England town hall meetings. You were not a citizen because church and state were united. And so if you're not an accepted member of the church, you're not a citizen either or a politician. Then if they did believe your account of having been born again, they wanted letters of recommendation and they wanted witnesses to show that you had become more Christ-like since your born again experience. Again, a lot of religion here, but in theology, right? Justification is a religious term for being treated as if you are holy, even though you're not holy, because Christ puts his righteousness upon you. Sanctification is when you actually start becoming more like Jesus and holier in your behavior, your lifestyles, your interactions, etc. So they wanted proof of both, that you had been justified or born again or saved, and also sanctified, been made more like Christ. And if they didn't buy it, they didn't accept you into the church. Then get this, they sent around select men whom they elected every year to go and spy on the houses to see what you were up to in your private life. And if they felt like you were living in sin, they would report it to the church, and you would have to go and do public penance for everyone to see in humiliating fashion. If not, if you refuse to repent, then they would banish you from Boston and send you out to Connecticut or Maine or Rhode Island. And so pretty intense stuff, right? As far as this kind of very exclusive facet to Puritan culture. And then, of course, that plays into the whole Salem witch trials also, right? There are books that take a real gender orientation to looking at the Salem witch trials and showing that from the sermons that were preached and from the primary sources that we have and the practices that they engaged in, that they really looked down upon women as being especially weak and more vulnerable for the devil to trick and to seduce into sin. And so it's no coincidence to a lot of people that most of the victims of the Salem witch trials were women, culturally seen as being more vulnerable to the devil's attack. So there was always that fear that the devil was always looming over your shoulder, trying to get you to be up to no good and to lead you astray so that you don't take the heavenly trip, right? And so, and along with that, right, comes the notion of the covenant, covenant. And it's the idea that the Puritans made a social contract, a contract with God himself, and that whereby they expected, it comes from the Old Testament of the Bible with the Hebrew people, whereby if they follow his laws and rules, like the 10 Commandments, let's say, right? If they're following his rules, then he will control the variables outside their control. He'll control weather and storms, crop yields, protection against Native Americans and other enemies, protection against pathogens and disease, right, etc. But on the contrary, if people are found sinning, then God might turn his back on the community and let all hell ring loose, right? And so hence you have the members of the selectmen who came door to door to spy on people because they felt like your sin might get the entire community into trouble. All right. So any questions on that? Pretty dramatic topic, huh? The Puritans are kind of anything but boring. So then I just gave you a section on the Salem witch trials. You don't have to do anything with that. I don't even believe it's on the test, but if you wanted to look into that, by all means. Okay. And then moving on to Pennsylvania and New York, numbers 3 and 4 of the Northern Colonies, right? Note, right, in court history, when it praises the winners and the leaders of the country, court history tries to contend that Pennsylvania and New York were many examples, right? They use the term microcosm. They were a microcosm, a mini example of what we believe America stands for, or Americana. And that is, right, tolerance and opportunity for all, okay? And so when you see and you read court history of Pennsylvania and New York, that's what you're going to run into. So you'll be able to identify it now. So, okay, this is court history. They're bragging about the opportunities in this colony and the toleration that the leaders acknowledged, right? So in both cases, right, they contend that it was by nature of those who were ruling as well as circumstantial. Okay, so by nature of those who were ruling, William Penn, the emphasis on number 3 is his religious conversion, right? Is that supposedly before he became a Quaker, he represented all the negative stereotypes of rich, wealthy, privileged people. That his life was very superficial. He went around chasing women and living for pleasure and for travel and enjoyment, etc. Right? But supposedly he does a 180 when he becomes converted to the Quaker denomination of Christianity. Because with the Quaker denomination, right, they are all about that which is returning to pristine Christianity, away from anything that can divert our attention from devotion to God. So especially meaning riches, sinful temptation, the worries of this world, etc. Right? And so the idea is William Penn is almost trying to engage in compensation for his earlier life. He's given these almost just arbitrary powers by the King of England to rule over Pennsylvania, right? He says you can make laws of your own making as long as they don't violate English law. Have fun with it, right? He said also, you are the landowner of all Pennsylvania, that everyone else is basically a renter, and they have to pay like these medieval-like quitrents or rent payments to you. So he could have really taken advantage of that, right? But in his Quaker religion, arguably one of the biggest values amongst the Quakers was meekness, right? And to me, meekness is being very humble and very gentle with the strength that God gives you. And so hence, having that power, right, he chose to be meek, and he established a republican form of government. And like Rome, like the United States today, a republican form of government has some positions that are handpicked and others that are elected popularly. And they have checks and balances with one another, right? It's supposed to be a well-balanced government and it's supposed to be largely representative or elected. And so he chose to have a legislator that would, the lower house of which would be elected by the citizens, by the people. He chose citizenship to become very easy. No religious test for it as there were elsewhere, but that you come, you vow to abide by the laws, and it's pretty much that simple. You become a citizen in Pennsylvania. And so then, therefore, you could vote and you can run for office, right? He declared, of course, religious toleration. I'll put a PowerPoint up. I have a PowerPoint of his edict of religion. And so, again, that was anomalous. That was out of the ordinary, whereby you did not have to believe in God. You do not have to be a Protestant Christian, a Quaker Christian, etc., right, to be entitled to your basic rights as a citizen. And so politically, he was meek, okay? He had the right to veto, and he only used his governor rights to veto twice. In both cases, it was something for which he felt the very strongly that the legislator was in the wrong, one of which was against Native Americans, and he did to protect the rights of Native Americans, okay? And then secondly, in addition to being politically meek here in Pennsylvania, right, he also was economically generous, okay? And so note, for the first, it was the first 1,000 arrivals he gave free land to in Pennsylvania. He would habitually look and see what the price of a freehold was. A freehold was about 120 acres of land. Of the price of a freehold in other colonies, and he tried to go at about half that price in Pennsylvania. So Pennsylvania developed a reputation for the cheapest and also quite fertile land available for a lot of people there, okay? He also established almshouses, ALMS, and then house. An almshouse, I think of like the Gospel Mission Place on Yosemite in Modesto, where the homeless could come and they could get food and quarter and have their basic needs taken care of, and they were taught a trade. And from that trade, that was supposed to help them to get onto their feet, to be able to get a job and get financially on their feet, right? So the almshouses were very highly reputable to many of the Christians in the colonial time period. And I would make the argument that there were more almshouses talked about in Pennsylvania than in any other colony, all right? And then also he had a large number, just about as high a number as elsewhere, as anywhere else, of grog shops, G-R-O-G. And grog shops were where anyone could come in and apprentice him or herself to become an artisan, a skilled worker, and learn under a master workman, right? Then that person becomes a journeyman working under a master worker, and then eventually gains his independence and his or her independence and works independently, making a service or product of some sort. So the grog shops were big in Pennsylvania as well. And when you look at advertisement and the downright effort to enlist the immigration of people from marginalized areas in Europe, I don't think anywhere comes close to Pennsylvania. And remember, what I mean by marginalized is that you're metaphorically left to the corner. The same opportunities that are available for other people are not available for you. So in American history, oftentimes people have characterized an African-American enclave like in Compton or in Oakland as a marginalized area. So they went after the marginalized areas throughout Europe and encouraged them to come. So many of them came as separate religious communities. A lot of the early Mennonites and Quakers and Church of the Brethren and these other kind of marginal Protestant denominations came into Pennsylvania knowing that they would receive economic opportunities and religious toleration and freedom, okay? And a lot of them came from the Rhine area of Germany, where they did not have the same rights and opportunities, okay? So any questions on number 4? That's also Court History of William Penn. Let's see here. Or I'm sorry, number 3. That was number 3. I apologize. With number 4, right, is I try to show more complexity with William Penn and say, well, who exactly was this guy, right? Because on the one hand, he went out of his way to ensure that Native Americans agreed to all land transactions, right? Which is true. But at the same time, he very often went out of his way to try to buy more and more land from Native Americans. The Native Americans began in derogatory fashion to call him the Penn Quill. No, thank you, I understand. The Penn Quill, because they associated him with just constantly approaching the Native Americans and asking land that he could buy from them. When certain tribes began to sell most of their land, and they took a very kind of short-sighted decision, is like the Iroquois. They saw that fur trade was huge. So they went in the St. Lawrence Valley. They took over from the Huron, that territory, so they could be the purveyors, the providers of the fur to the Englishmen. And they made a lot of money from it. But in the long run, they lost because they sold their land to do it. And so William Penn encouraged the same type of phenomenon with the tribes in Pennsylvania. He got them to sell most of their land, and he didn't seem to lose any sleep over it. And there's evidence to suggest that he knew that the far future did not bode well for them for that very reason. Okay, no problem. Thank you. I understand. Nisabeth Sanchez, thank you. So let's see here. So with number 4, I'm trying to show you a sense of ambiguity. Yes, son. No. Sorry about that. My son came in. So you see some unclearness, some ambiguity with number 4. On the one hand, this man engaged, he learned the Native Americans' culture, engaged in rituals of theirs, The most famous was the out of the woods ceremony, when he would blow smoke upon the Native Americans as they left the Allegheny Mountains to take the demonic spirits off of them. And he followed their protocol. Now, did he believe in those things religiously? No, but it was a sign of respect. He learned, they think, close to a dozen dialects of Native American languages to show them respect symbolically and to treat them as equals. But then again, like I said, with number 4, he also went out of his way. He got a lot of pressure from Englishmen, whereby, for instance, by his own writing and admissions and his own diaries and letters, he contended that he was stuck between a rock and a hard place, whereby certain immigrants into Pennsylvania, or would-be immigrants from Europe, had a lot of money, and they were willing to become creditors or lenders or bankers, right? And they could help out a lot of poor people in Pennsylvania. But they wanted to be assured before they came here that all of the land that they were purchasing not only was fertile, but it was devoid of any Native Americans, because they had read, we talked about that in an earlier assignment, right? How sometimes European chroniclers here in the US would even exaggerate how ruthless and dangerous the Native Americans were, because it'd be a good sell, this exotic, kind of scary book that Europeans like to read about. So they wanted their area to be devoid of natives. So William Penn then would go out of his way to try to get the Native Americans in that section to sell all of their land to him. And so, yeah, draw your own conclusion on that, okay? That I kind of throw up the fact that he was a little bit of an enigma, a puzzle, when it came to his respect for Native Americans. And then number 5, Dutch New Netherlands is, on the one hand, right, the Dutch in the Netherlands or Holland, right, all the same people, they became more tolerant than many other countries in Europe. Some people believe it was kind of an anti-model thing, is because the Spanish colonized them and they enforced the Spanish-hated Inquisition upon the Dutch. So when they broke free, one of the first things they did in the Hague, in their parliament back in Holland, is they established freedom of religion in the Netherlands. And so hence it stands to reason they're going to allow it when they come to New York. So they sent the Dutch West India Company and gave them sanction, the Hague did back in Holland, for the Dutch West India Company to colonize New York. And they named it New Netherlands, right? And they largely ensconced themselves in New York City and named it New Amsterdam after their big city of Amsterdam. And so a lot of money was to be made in the fur trade. A lot of bourgeois people came who knew a lot of trades and practiced a lot of trades. Not only that, they offered burgher rights. Just like bourgeoisie in French means of the city, burg, the suffix burg in Germanic means city. So burgher rights, B-U-R-G-H-E-R, burgher rights were city rights. And they were the rights to start a business, gain access to loans, buy property, and also vote and even run for certain offices in New Netherlands. So the Dutch established burgher rights to virtually everyone who was willing to come into New Netherlands, and especially if they invested in the Dutch West India Company and bought shares in their company. So a couple demographics that came in large numbers were Jewish people from Brazil who had been kicked out from there, and from throughout Europe with pogroms and these persecution programs against them. And so with the Dutch having developed a reputation for tolerance, they moved to New York City. And you'll see, however, evidence of the governor, the Dutch governor of New Netherlands or New York, wanting to very much circumscribe what they could and couldn't do purely out of prejudice. We have it in his own writing. The same stereotypes you hear of the Jewish people from the medieval time period, that they were killers of Christ, that all they cared about was money and they were parasites, etc. The same old ugly stereotypes. And so at any rate, they what's interesting is the Dutch West India Company, when they wrote back, they said, yes, we do believe that the Jewish people are money hungry and they need to be watched. So they bought into that stereotype. They wrote it down on paper for us to read today. But they said, nevertheless, they're contributing to our economic success. They're major shareholders in the Dutch West India Company. They're major partakers in the fur trade with the Iroquois out of Albany, New York. And so hence, as long as they're abiding by the law, as long as they're helping us make money, leave them alone. And the same thing was said of the Quakers in New York when the Dutch governor wanted to get rid of the Quakers as well. So you see, to my point, and what I want you to know on the test is I subjectively, just me, make the point that when someone like Roger Williams in Rhode Island, who was banished by the Puritans because of his disagreements with them over church and state, he wanted church and state to be separated, over rights of Native Americans, he stood up for them, and over other things with theology, he was banished by the Puritans. So when he went and founded Rhode Island, one of his first things he said on principle was to establish freedom of religion, because he did not want to be like the Puritans. Again, William Penn, you could make the argument that it was his religious conviction, being a new convert to Quaker Christianity, that prompted him to establish freedom of religion, right, in his colony. But with the Dutch, the argument goes from these very kind of indicting, self-incriminating quotes that we have to read to this very day, that they tended to be less tolerant, but they simply were more tolerant out of economic pragmatism. Like, hey, we don't like them, we think lesser of them, so let's just put up with them, however, if they're helping us make money. And one more example I'll give to you, and I won't give you the details, but if you look up Anthony the Turk, he actually wasn't a Turk, he was a Moroccan, but he was a very dark-skinned man. They did not like the fact that he lived with a white woman. They did not like the fact that he was guilty of several misdemeanors like public drunkenness and a fight. He got in a couple fights in public, etc., right? But again, they wrote disparagingly of him in the primary sources, the Dutch leaders, that is. Nevertheless, they said, let him be, because his role is pivotal in the fur trade. So again, to me, I subjectively make the argument for the test and for this assignment on the last number here, that tolerance in Dutch New York was more economically driven and more practical or pragmatic than it was idealistic, and actually believing in equality of all people and equal freedoms to be enjoyed by all people, etc. So any questions? All right, so on the test, we've gone over number 28, New Albion seed, right? That certain demographics, the bourgeoisie took over the North and made it in their image. Yes.
I was just wondering, so William Penn, was he the only Quaker that was like kind of like cool with the Indians and the Puritans and all of that?
No, but he did develop a reputation like the second generation, right? He came in the 1680s. By the 1720s, the Quakers were fighting with the natives, not literally in war, but they were already making comments that William Penn, their predecessor, had been too soft on them and had been too accommodating to them. So yeah, no, he wasn't the only one, but he definitely stood out. And by the second generation, they were not nearly as accommodating to the Native Americans as he had been and his own generation. Yeah.
I was just curious because it seems like from what I was reading in one of the sections, like he was the only one that stood out to me.
Yeah, and in many ways he did. Yeah, in many ways he did. Yeah, like I said, the second generation after him, nowhere near as accommodating and as egalitarian, putting the natives on equal footing. And they even disparagingly mentioned William Penn almost as if he had kind of spoiled the Native Americans and gave them a sense of entitlement that the future Quakers resented. Yeah.
I see.
Yep. But that's a good question. Anything else or anyone else? That's good. I like that. I love questions. All right. So we've done number 29 as well. My contrast, right? And saying that I believe that the Dutch, with their issue of religious tolerance, it was less idealistic, but more practical and pragmatic, and getting them to make money, right? To make money together. Number 30 is court history of William Penn. We went over that. Number 31, the fact that he was an enigma, kind of a puzzle, that he was so respectful to Native Americans, but he was always pressuring them to sell their land to him. Remember that, and you'll get 31 correct. Number 32 is court history of Puritan New England, about how they were forward-looking and more democratic and at the forefront of scientific discovery, etc. Right? You get that, and you'll have 31 fine, or I'm sorry, 32, and then 33. Remember the 180 that we took, that their society arguably was kind of angst-filled. There was a lot of anxiety or fear of the future regarding the devil, regarding Native Americans whom they distrusted all around them. Regarding any kind of challenge to their authority. As far as challenge to their authority, if I could just briefly mention Anne Hutchinson. A woman named Anne Hutchinson had her own Bible study groups without their permission, and she even taught that she used the term of Jesus, saying that talking about the wheat and the tares. The wheat symbolized those who were going to go to heaven, and the tares, like the weeds, symbolize those who were going to go to hell. And Jesus said, don't worry about trying to discern between the wheat and the tares to his disciples, as far as church members in this present world, that there are a lot of people that there are going to be some surprises. Some seemingly very holy people and religious leaders are going to be tares in disguise, but they're not going to fool God, right? So she gave a famous kind of sermon in one of her Bible studies, and she noted that scripture from Jesus talking to his disciples. And she said, who knows, some of our own Puritan leaders are probably tares in disguise. They're probably agents of the devil, and you just don't even know it. Well, they brought her out and made her recant. Repent is to change your sinful behavior. Recant is to take back your sinful words and what you claim you believe. They demanded that she recant, and she refused. And she said that she wanted to challenge them to a biblical debate over certain things that they held to be true. And instead of accepting her debate, they simply banished her from Boston. And isn't that ironic, right? Because they claim to be, followers of Martin Luther of the Protestant Reformation, and Martin Luther challenged the Pope and his cardinals to a debate over what it takes for someone to go to heaven. And they just kind of resorted to their power and excommunicated him instead of letting him have that debate. So they acted the same way that they claim the Catholic Church had to their leaders. So let's see here. Number 34 is again redundant about the Dutch and how they were arguably a little bit more cosmopolitan, more citizens of the world, allowing burger rights to all people coming in, but yet a lot of it seemed to be tied to economic concerns. That's a little bit redundant. 35, look up the Navigation Acts and see if they were stifling in the textbook. I think you'll find they were not. Number 36, which of the following is false regarding the Sacred Expedition? That was 1769 throughout the 1770s, the 21 missions of the Spanish up the coast of California. Philip II wanted to ensure that it was a peaceful colonization as opposed to an army invading California. They did it by way of missions, of cities or pueblos, presidios or military forts, and haciendas or plantations. That was kind of the four institutions they used to colonize, right? And remember, there is a lot of controversy between court history of the Spanish friars and priests being very paternalistic, very father-like, and making sacrifices and looking after their Native American charges in the missions, and them being very tyrannical, making the Native Americans kill and drop their own culture, using physical punishment in some cases. And if they ran away, they would chase them down and forcefully bring them back to the mission because they believed that they would revert to their pagan religion if they left the mission and their soul would be in danger. All right. Number 37, a little bit redundant, about the Iroquois and how they used their agency over the fur tribe, the fur trade, to take over the St. Lawrence River so that they could be the purveyors or providers of furs to the English and the French and the Dutch. Number 38, just kind of an old basic, just for your information question. St. Augustine, Florida is the oldest European created city in this country to this day. It was established in 1565 in Florida, and it's still the oldest remaining Euro-American city, St. Augustine, Florida. All right, we talked about the covenant and how the covenant caused the Puritans to infringe upon other people's liberties and rights, right? The idea that if anyone's sinning in the community, God will get angry and punish the whole community for it. So they were all up in your business to make sure that you were not living in sin. And so the modern notions of you do what you want to do, I do what I want to do, that largely came from classical liberalism. Like if you read a guy named John Stuart Mill, he was kind of the spokesman for that. You do your business, I do mine. As long as we don't infringe upon each other's rights, it's all good. That doesn't come until the 1800s. So the Puritans were not big on individual freedoms within their colonies. And then if you look up in the book, Tories in the English Parliament in the 1770s, they did not stand up for the rights of colonists. They were the Conservative Party back in England who wanted to put us in our place and felt like when we began our Stamp Act riots and protesting the taxes, etc., they felt like we were spoiled ingrates who needed to be put in our place. And so it was the Tories who were largely responsible on the end of the British for going to war against us in our war for independence. All right, so I feel like we've covered the test. We've covered this week's argumentative assignment. And so I think you guys are ready. Okay, so in a few days, I will, by the end of the weekend, I will have the test put under quizzes, test 1. You have all week to do it. And you also have all week to do a textbook quiz. So no argumentative assignment this next week coming up, just your test and a quiz. Okay? And you guys kind of getting accustomed to my style, to my quirky style, to my argumentative assignment?
Yeah, I'm getting used to it. I'm running a little behind just because of everything going on, but I'm working on the new one too.
Okay, good.
I'm working on both.
Good. And I've told a couple people that have Canvas messaged me or have texted me on my second phone number. Some people have a couple students who are going through a lot. And I say, hey, don't worry about it saying late. I'll write your name down, turn in the assignment, and I won't deduct any points.
Okay.
So just communicate with me if you have something major going on, okay? And I'll remind myself not to mark any points down for it being late.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, no problem. I know life happens.
Yeah.
Anyone else or anything else before we get off the phone? We get off the video. All right. So good luck, you guys. Okay, just stick with it. And like I said, I'm already to the point where I'm enjoying looking at your argumentative write-ups. You guys are sharp. You guys really are. You guys tend to catch my thesis on each section very easily and have something pretty clever to say about it. And so that never ceases to impress me. All right.
Are all of the sections gonna be, is there gonna usually be 8 of them? Like typically 8?
No, I mean, they really vary. As you'll see, we'll have a couple more that have about that many, and you'll still have a couple more that only have about 3.
Okay.
Yeah. So yeah, sorry, they really vary in length.
It's a lot to get through, but I'm
It
getting through
is,
'em.
it is. Yeah, I apologize.
It's okay.
But yeah,
Well, have a good day.
definitely read them, right?
Yeah.
If you're just writing on one of them, definitely read all of them. It'll definitely
Okay.
help you for the test.
Yeah, I noticed that when I get through a section and then I start reading my book, it like coincides with each other. So
Good, I hope so. That's what
yeah,
they're supposed to do. Right on. Yeah, I definitely don't like doing that's why I do argumentative, is I don't want to do just exactly what's in the book, because what's the use of doubling up on that? You might as well just have the
yeah,
book as your teacher. So I like them to supplement each other.
yeah. It's good to see a different perspective too.
Good,
It
I hope
helps.
so. I hope so. Yeah, I want you guys to critically think, and I like to think that it makes class a little less boring for those of you who don't like history, by making things argumentative and
I
opinionated.
love history, but I haven't taken a college history class. This is my first college history class, and it's so
Oh,
different from what they teach us in high school.
yeah, yeah. And to
They
be
leave a
honest,
lot of stuff out.
good. And I intend it to be honest. I want it to be. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right.
All
So
right. Well, have a great day.
you too. Thank you. Thank you for your questions. I really
You're
appreciate that.
welcome. Bye
All
bye.
right, everyone. Have a good day, okay? Any other last minute questions? All right. Goodbye. Okay. Have a good one.